Thank you all for joining us today at this forum. I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to my colleagues at the RVI, the British Institute, IFRA, Toweza, and Cheche Books for bringing this event to life. We're truly honored to be paying tribute to an extraordinary figure today. Ngugi was not just a literary icon, but a political force whose work continues to inspire movements and shape discourse on democracy, identity, and freedom in Kenya and beyond. It is both an honor and a deep responsibility to host this critical conversation at a time when the country is facing such difficult political circumstances. Our moderator today is Dr. Tom Odhiambo, a professor of literature at the University of Nairobi. Joining him are distinguished panelists, including Honorable Yusuf Hassan, Member of Parliament for Kamkunji constituency, who shares a long-standing history with Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Sitawa Namwalie, a poet, a performer, and a playwright whose work powerfully engages with the themes of decolonization central to Ngugi's work. Professor Kimani is a renowned linguist who has worked very closely with Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o as well over the years. And we have Mohamed Amin Abdishukri, a promising young socio-political commentator and an active member of the Gen Z movement here in Kenya. My name is Amina Abdul Kadir. I manage the Rift Valley Forum at the Rift Valley Institute. The Rift Valley Forum is a platform that is dedicated to critical exploration of important political, economic, and social issues within the Horn and Eastern Africa. Please note that this session is being recorded. For those joining us online, kindly note that your microphones are muted, so you're not able to speak. But if you have any comments, questions, please post them at the tabs at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A section and the comment section. To celebrate Professor Ngugi's promotion of African culture and language, as well as in honor of all our fallen heroes, we will be opening this forum with a performance by Sitawa Namwalie and her team, dubbed Names of the Dead. Please join me in welcoming Sitawa and her team. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to see you all here, commemorating a great son of Kenya who had such an impact on all of us and definitely on me. So we're going to perform for you. We're going to perform a poem called Names of the Dead, which I wrote a few years ago and unfortunately horribly resonates right now. Before we begin, let me introduce myself and my cast. So my name is Sitawa Namwalie, and this is Willie Rama, Anthem Republic, and El Nez. So the poem Names of the Dead will be performed in 3 languages: English, Kiswahili, and Sheng. I originally wrote it in English, and it was translated into Sheng and Kiswahili by El Nez, who is a Sheng scholar, an MC, and a rapper. And she's absolutely brilliant. Please, if you need a translation and an understanding of Sheng, a deep understanding of Sheng, please approach her. And please approach her with the money, because the skills are very, very precious, because the thing about Sheng is that it's a moving target. Whatever is happening this year is not what's going to be happening next year, and she's got to keep abreast, yeah? One of the other things about this poem, the Sheng version is going to be in symbolic Sheng. Did you know there's a thing called symbolic Sheng? Did you know there's a thing called basic Sheng? Today you know. And symbolic Sheng is high Sheng. So that's a version that we're going to be using today. And don't worry, those of you who are sitting here saying, I don't know any Sheng, listen to the poem in English, in Kiswahili, and then in Sheng. It's the same poem. We will then be asking you to allow yourself to feel and experience the poem on a personal level in the different languages. Think about how is it hitting you in English, in Kiswahili, and in Sheng. Because what we're doing is we're demonstrating what Ngugi was doing and talking about in promoting and celebrating African languages. So we do have a test afterwards, so pay attention. Okay? Thank you very much. Let us begin. Names of the dead. I collect the names of the dead, the names of the 1,300 dead. Let other people amass land, cars, shoes, belts. Let them boast about those things. It is me who will save the names of the dead, the names of the lives we destroyed. In the aftermath of primitive pride, toxic adults reverted to childish games, blatant, discolored with rage. They refused to follow rules, stole the people's election, and then stood firm, blameless, clean. When the buildings stopped burning, when machetes were blunted, when packs of hunting gangs dispersed, when fear receded, when tempers abated, when the smoke finally drifted away, 1,300 lay dead. And we looked on the work of our hands, unrepentant, not an ounce of regret furrowed our brow. Instead, we shouted, forget, forget, forget. Their names we must forget. I collect the names of the dead, the names of the 1,300 dead. Let other people amass land, shoes, cars, belts. Let them preen about those things. It is me who will save the names of the dead, the names of the lives we destroyed. Names come to me from unexpected places, slowly, slowly, one by one. They slip past offended silence, glide knife-like through indifferent kindness. Soundless, they must avoid detection. Shh. Some others arrive banging, loudly wailing, insistent, inconvenient. They won't be buried. No matter how they appear, I place them in jars. With infinite tenderness, line them along shelves, lids shut tight. They cannot escape. Or worse, get stolen by those who hide the names of the dead, by those who vanish names like trails of smoke. No names, no sin, no sin, no crime.
Waraka wa wafu. Na kusanya majina ya wafu. Majina ya wafu 1,300. Waache wengine wapore mali, mashamba, magari, viatu na mishipi. Mimi ndiye nitakaye okoa majina ya wafu. Majina ya maisha yetu. Matokeo ya kiburi kisicho kifani. Wanadamu watoro walirudia michezo ya kitoto hadharani, waziwazi, hisia za hasira za mchizi na kupora kura za raia. Halafu wakasimama kidete, pasipo na kasoro, wasafi. Mijengo ilipoacha kuchomeka, mapanga yalipochujika, genge la wawindaji liliposambaratika, uoga ulipodidimia, hamaki zikapunguka na moshi ukapaa, 1,300 walilala chini, wameaga. Halafu tukatazama kazi ya mikono yetu. Kasoro nyuso, kasoro majuto, ila tukawika msamaha. Sahau, zika, sahau, zika katika kaburi la sahau. Na kusanya majina ya wafu. Majina ya watu 1,300. Wachache, waache wengine wapore mali, mashamba, viatu na mishipi. Mimi ndiye nitakayeokoa majina ya wafu. Mimi, majina ya maisha tuliyoangamiza. Majina hunikujia kutoka sehemu nisizozitarajia. Pole pole, moja baada ya nyingine, yanapenya kupita kimya kilichokuazika, yanapasua mfumo wa kisu kwenye utu usio na huruma, yananyamaa kimya. Lazima tujikinge dhidi ya kujulikana. Mengine huwasili yakibisha kwa vishindo, yanawika kwa ushurutisho, kwa usisitizo, kwa usumbufu, hayazikiki. Haijalishi yalivyo, yuhifadhi ndani ya birika kwa upole na utaratibu. Uzipanga ukutani, haziwezi kutoroka ama kabisa kuporwa na wale ambao huficha waraka wa wafu, wale ambao hupoteza majina kama mvuke kwa moshi. Pakosapo majina hakuna dhambi. Pakosapo dhambi hakuna uhalifu.
Sasa tuengeze isivo Mado, Islando na area kama hizo, majina ya waliogenya. Mi hugata majina ya wale wase waligenya, wale wametoshea kwa casket. Majina za wale ngiri na hosla utat wamenyuria. Sara Mamoreo Inengi, Wachai Mashake, Madinga, Mandula, Mabelt. Chana na wajiringe na hizo mbege. Ni misi mi. Ndo mi ugada majina za wale wametoshea kwa casket. Majina za maisha si wenyewe tumeharibu. Vitu zilimwakalaiza afuta maringo sosa. Mamorio kukreki. Kujirudisha mpaka kalongolongo. Kujagas nayo. wakabonda kufuata sheria, uchawi, wakachai election za wadhi, alafu wakasafisha para. Gita makeja zilisare kushikanare, ile gita mbogi za kugenya wase zilifunga wax, ile gita kubuya ilipungua, ile gita kukreki ilishuka na moshi ikapotelea. Wase Brambo Jamo na Hos Utar walikuwa wametos chini, wamepigwa itoka. Alafu tukakemba wax za mikono zetu kimachobano, anakwata kama juto kang'o kalisikika, lakini tulifungua voko. Valia digaga, hizo majina zao tuzivalie digaga, majina zao tuziforget. Mimi ndo ukata majina za wale wase walitoshea kwa casket, majina za wale ngiri na hosla kwenye wamenyuria. Sare mamorio wa inengi wa chai mashake, mandula, mishipi, mandai, achana nao ringe na hizo mpeke. Ni misi mi. Omiuga hata majina za wale walitoshea kwa casket, wale wenye maisha zao tulipunguza. Majina humwokalize kutoka sector si expect. Mdagi, Jamo, kwa ingine zinapenya kimya, imetunduliwa, zinakata kama kisu kwa roho, akantambua safi chafu bila kuchoma, lazima zifiche para. Cheza chini zinengi. So umokalize zimepandisha volume, zinapiga mandwere, ziko zile za twende tena sana. Zinakatia mbaya, hazizi kwangu hii. Vile zinakaa imati, na zisetingi nditni kwa birika, kwa upole inenge inanga wengi, na ziorganize fresh kwa shell. Imetinga vitait, haziwezi zikajitoa rehani ama ngori zaidi kuchaiwa na wale wase ambao wanasundaga majina za wafu, wale wametosea kwa casket, wale ambao wanageuzanga majina zikweka moshi. Majina zikisundwa kinena, hakuna kesi, hakuna lawama. Kama hakuna lawama, hakuna kesi iko. Jumna kesi nini kitu iko?
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're just going to have 4 people share very briefly, please, which language affected you the most? What did you observe and feel? Please put your hands up if you'd like to share. And, you know, he's a good friend of mine, so we're going to start with you.
Thank you so much, guys. I mean, for me, I was absolutely taken up completely by Sheng, notwithstanding my generation, but it was so powerful for me. Yani wale jamaa wanatoshea kwenye casket, hao ndio tunawagather. I mean, for me, it spoke deeply. And of course, you know, not to suggest that the English or Kiswahili did not, but I think it's the intensity of the imagination that Sheng brings with it that carried me. Yeah, that carried me. So yeah, great guys. I mean, absolutely. Asante sana.
We will not be offended if you say, and if you diss any of the other ones, or if you prefer one other than the other one. Okay? So somebody else? Yes.
I want to appreciate the performance. The Sheng beat, especially the body rendition, to me was very bubbly, and it was engaging. I felt like also coming out of my body to just dance with the rhythm.
So it's so interesting what you both said. I went with Ernest to Germany on an exchange. We didn't know each other at that time. An exchange between German and Kenyan poets, MCs, and rappers and spoken word artists. And when I heard Sheng out of its context, all I could hear was raw youth energy. I was mesmerized, and I've been using it, although I do not speak it. But then, of course, you have translators ever since, precisely because of that. It's so immediate, it's so powerful, and the imagery is incredible. Somebody else? Yeah.
In as much as many people in Nairobi, urban areas, we speak Sheng, like in informal settlements, in rural areas, they don't know that Sheng. So that Kiswahili was very powerful. Kiswahili message, asante.
Yes, thank you very much. We mustn't forget that Sheng is actually a very Nairobi thing. It's not in other places. Somebody else? Anybody?
Thank you very much. I am from Southern Africa, so I only was able, I was able to understand the words that you recited, but I was still caught up with the performances in the other languages. So thank you for having the English.
Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to hand over to Amina. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll bow. We forgot to bow.
Thank you so much, Sitawa and your team, for that wonderful performance. Very moving. It also reminds us that memory is a form of resistance, and that's to speak of the colon is to keep their struggles alive. So let's continue talking about our foreign heroes. Thank you so much. I'll hand over to Tom Odhiambo, our moderator for today, to start us off with a conversation. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Odhiambo. Hello? I'll do that. He's asking me how we're going to sit, and I'm going to disrupt the sitting arrangement as it's been done, because increasingly I disrupt the sitting arrangements at these places. If I'd come in earlier, I would have done my own thing, which would have been to push you back this way so that we create a conversational circle instead of having this power speaking to them approach. I do this all the time, and I'm going to do it right now. But the reason I won't do it is because there's recording going on. And the recording is kind of structured. This is how you realize that instruments actually control you when you think you control them. But still, I'll try to close this gap. So when Ngugi passed on, I think news broke at noon, around 2, around here, and I received a lot of texts. Tom, is this true? I said, I just write for the Nation newspapers. I've been writing for Kenyan newspapers for 26 years right now, but I'm not a journalist in-house. Although I am described as a columnist, I do not necessarily generate copy every week because newspapers have become trickier. They don't pay you if you submit a copy that they've not solicited for. Okay, and even if you're a columnist, they decide when to run what you have and not, because there's no money around the corner. They pay the managers quite well. they don't pay us kanda ya moko that much. Actually, what newspapers pay me now, Nation started by paying me 20,000 shillings per copy 12 years ago. Then it went to 10,000 and it's now 6,000. Standard started by paying me 5, it went to 3, it went to 15, it's 0. If you write for them, Standard makes money off Raila. We pray he lives long enough for them to continue making money. This forum has 4 speakers, but actually it has everybody registered in this room as a speaker. And I would want to urge that don't leave here without speaking. I come from Kisumu, and as you must have seen when we were escorting our teacher, Albert Ojwang, everybody sang, danced, waved their twig. Everybody who goes to mourn in Lowland has to perform, lest the spirits ask him, are you the one who did me in? Because if you are not active, we know. If you go to a funeral in Lowland and you just walk in, and Kimani be warned, and you just quiet, we know you are the doer. You understand? So I want to say that Ngugi was a very, should we say, people think that if you say talkative, that it's disparaging. No, to be talkative is a good thing. You bring the human spirit to a place. The last time I had an interview with Ngugi was in Henry Chakava's house in Karen. And I think the reason he didn't talk too much is that he's just been given tea. And tea doesn't help you to open up for some of us. But he talked so extensively, so intensively, I feel horrible that I don't know where the interview is. But we recorded almost a 2-hour interview. Now, because he's not here, and you all claim to have read him, to have known him, to have listened to him, you must say something about him before you leave. So these 3 gentlemen and the lady allows them to sit. We're gonna carve it a little bit to sit there and here like this so that we start this conversation. They have about 10 minutes to say something. I was mocking academics the last week that you do research for 15 years and you go to a conference and they give you 15 minutes and you pay 15,000. You see that? It's terrifying to write these long things and then you come and they tell you 15 minutes. And I'm generally very, very difficult with time. If it's 10 minutes, it's 10 minutes. Because the rest of the stuff, the real good stuff at conferences never happen in the conference room. It's outside. And the real good stuff from this will happen once you leave this space. When you say, you struck me. So for the performers here, you struck me once more by quoting a number which I thought you should have quoted it correctly, which I always write and say 1,300 plus. There's no closed figure. When you close it as 1,300 as Kenya National Commission for Human Rights and Kenya Commission for Human Rights put it, it's closed. And those who just died, there are people who actually died in Nakuru by just seeing the dead. There's an old man who died in Nakuru after he saw his cattle slashed. They were not even taken away, they were just slashed, the teeth cut, and he just collapsed and died. So it really struck me deeply, that number 1,300. I always put a plus on it just to make sure there are others. But thank you so much for bringing that. So I will ask you to come and sit so that you can sit here. And Mishma, you can sit there. Sitawa, you can sit there. Kimani, you can sit here. And the chair, we leave it for Ngugi. Yes, his spirit is around. So we'll leave that chair for Ngugi. I'll sit. Yes, there's a session on Mzee, so that's his chair. The spirit is here. Yeah, and the reason this is important, the reason I want us to discuss is that he actually wrote an article in the newspaper today, Rungo Houghton, saying we must talk. We must talk in this country. So this is talking. That's why I am talking. Okay, and thank you very much, Irungu, for saying we must talk. We can't beat people with rungus hoping that they'll keep quiet. Okay, so we'll begin this. I know you've been given a formula, but I'll begin with the youth. Okay, and I never call the youth promising because can I tell you? You don't know, you wake up one morning and discover you are old. I was just reading a newspaper with my daughter, and she went to the fridge, brought me beer, and she came back and we started arguing. She was barely 6, and she said, Daddy, you are old. I said, why? She said, you have white hair, but you're also not thinking properly. That's what's going to happen to you. So we'll begin with the youth, and then cross over to Sitawa, and then come back to Kimani, and finish with Mheshimiwa. Because Mheshimiwa's, your article is very, very personal in the newspaper. I think that's probably the most personal article I've read in the newspaper. A lot of people have made claims about Ngugi, but yours in the newspaper today, in Nation, it's extremely personal. So you will end it. So you will.
Thank you so much, Tom. That's a very bleak introduction to know that you will one day age. I want to start by acknowledging that Ngugi wa Thiong'o had different phases and many phases, right? But primarily we can look at Ngugi, two Ngugis. The earlier Ngugi was the alliance educated, the colonial educated, that saw Christianity as a civilizing force. The Ngugi who went to Makerere, studied there, aspired to, even though he had a form of political consciousness and was still developing it, he aspired to English liberalism, like many of his peers at the time. Ngugi who admired D.H. Lawrence and Joseph Conrad and so on and so forth. There's that Ngugi. And then there's the later Ngugi, who is the Marxist, Fanonist, agnostic, decolonial, radical thinker, the militant revolutionary icon Ngugi. The Ngugi who gave us Petals of Blood, the Ngugi who gave us the revised version of A Grain of Wheat, the Ngugi who gave us the radical essays and the radical plays. And this Ngugi is the one that I'm particularly interested in. And this is the Ngugi that I want people in the current movement, the people's movement. I don't want to call it a Gen Z movement because it's a Gen Zote movement, right? Everybody's involved. So that's the Ngugi that I wish people would, that I want people to study and interact with. I have a few points to elaborate why I think so, and I hope time will allow me to do this. I have 6 points. The first one is Ngugi emphasized that we study history. In 2023, when Kenya was celebrating 60 years of independence, Ngugi published an article in the Standard. I don't know if they paid him for it. And the title of the article was, Do Not Cry for Me, Cry for Our Beloved Country. Towards the end of that article, Ngugi directly appeals to young people and to the youth. And he tells them to study history, and not just any type of history, but the history of struggle, the history of resistance, the history of these movements. Comrade Njogu is here, and he is one of the members at Ukombozi Library. In that article, Ngugi directed the youth to go to Ukombozi Library because there's so many resources there that they can study their history. And this was particularly important for me because over the last 1 year, there's been this narrative among certain elements in the movement that we are not our parents or that we are not the previous generation, right? And for me, this is a dangerous erasure of the history of radical resistance in this country. It's erasing the fact that resistance is a continuum, right? Going all the way back to the anti-colonial struggle, the Mekatililis, the Koitalels, the Wayaki Wahingas, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, also known as the Mau Mau, the Kenya People's Union, DTM wa Kenya, which I'm sure Yusuf will speak about, the Second Liberation, all the way to 2013, where we had the Occupy Parliament movement in 2013. This is not something that started yesterday. This is something that started way before. So we need to understand that. We need to do away with this historical amnesia and build on the works of the struggles that were there before us. That's the first point that I wanted to look at. The second thing that Ngugi, for me, does for this particular movement is his diagnosis of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism as the root of the problem. In, I think, 1986, if I'm not wrong, the comrades here will correct me, Ngugi published an article titled Writing Against Neocolonialism. And the good folks at Ukombozi have it, they reprinted it after he passed away, and I think they're selling it for 300 shillings or something. And in that article, Ngugi gives a perfect, astute, materialist analysis of Africa's trajectory through 3 decades. The first decade being the 50s, the anti-colonial struggle, the second decade being the 60s, the decade of independence, and then the third decade being the decade of neocolonialism, as he calls it, which is the 70s. And in that, it's that particular decade that I'm interested in because I still believe we live in that era of neocolonialism. In his analysis, and in that third phase is where the analysis of Ngugi comes to a revolutionary maturity. He points out the US-dominated transnational capital and the dominance of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And it's in that article that he points out that Africa had not been liberated, it had been more efficiently integrated into global capitalism. In that same analysis, Ngugi gives the formula that was used. The formula was simple but efficient. Dependence abroad and repression at home. And I don't need to mention the obvious, that we saw the manifestation of this formula last year when we saw a bill that was backed by the IMF and the World Bank, rejected by the Wananchi, and the state resorted to unleash its full force and its the full state machinery on the people and decided to kill its own. So the lesson for me from this is that continuous reminder, that continuous diagnosis of imperialism, neocolonialism, and capitalism as the problem, and everything else being symptoms, understanding that the governments that we have in Africa, at least majority of them, they're nothing more than foot soldiers for imperialism, and that the leaders or the heads of state that we have are nothing more than village elders. That analysis is important, village elders of imperialism. That analysis is important because it helps us identify the enemy and directly fight them. The third thing that Ngugi does for me that's relevant to this particular movement is his sharp class analysis. When Ngugi was launching Petals of Blood, when he was giving the speech, when he was launching Petals of Blood, his mother happened to be in the audience. And he started that speech by pointing to his mother and saying, and how proud he was that she was in the audience. But he didn't just call her his mother. He said, my peasant mother is in the audience. The reason why he said that is because that book, Petals of Blood, in Ngugi's own terms, was for the Kenyan peasantry. The Kenyan peasantry were the real main characters and the protagonists in that book. He goes on to say that the wealth we produce, who controls it, and how it's distributed should be a matter for all our concern. And that was the goal of that particular book, Petals of Blood. Later on, in the collection of essays called Homecoming, at the author's note, Ngugi said that post-independence Africa had only two tribes, the haves and the have-nots. And he went on to analyze the black bourgeoisie who inherited the colonialist system as compradors who were nothing more than middlemen, and their only function was to facilitate continued extraction of African wealth. In a later essay titled Writers in Politics, Ngugi called all of us to action, that we must join the proletariat and the poor peasant struggles against the parasitism of the comprador bourgeois, the landlords and chiefs, the big business, the big African business classes. And this analysis of class is also important when it comes to the protests, right? Because one thing that I won't deny the protest that happened last year and spilled over to this year is that it went across classes, right? Everybody was there, everybody was affected, whether you were in the upper class, the middle class, the lower class. I don't know if you have a middle class in this country, but everybody was affected, right? However, I mean, same tear gas for everybody, same threats of bullets, same threats of police brutality. However, in the evening, some of us went back to gated, fortified estates and communities, while others went to slums and mabatis and informal settlements and ghettos and shanties. And they continued into the night to face the brutalities of the state machinery in its different phases. So the question is, how are we going to democratize risk? How are we going to make sure that one class doesn't go home safely and the other class goes home to more brutality? Still have time? Okay. The fourth thing that I wanted to look at is the role of the intellectual, or the role of the knowledge producer. In many essays that Ngugi has written, at least in 4 essays, there's one central question that Ngugi keeps on asking: for whom do I write, right? And that question can be expanded. For whom do I write? For whom do I produce? Whether you're an artist, whether you're a musician, whatever you are, who is your target audience? And this question is not a literary question. It's not a question of target audience as we understand in the marketing world. It's a class question. Because you can either choose to write for what Ngugi calls the parasitic class who want to pass through Madare Valley and not see it, or you can choose to write for the peasants and the workers whose labor creates wealth, but they're denied access. Of course, you can choose to write for both. But this choice of audience determines 3 things. 1, it determines the language that you use. 2, it determines the stories that you tell. 3, it determines the contradictions that you either decide to expose or conceal. I'm sure Prof will and Sitawa will speak more about Kamerithu and Kamerithu theatre. Kamerithu was a cultural statement, yes. But for me, that's secondary. Primarily, the Kamerithu experiment was a class statement. It was Ngugi making his allegiance to the masses versus the bourgeoisie. And the goal of the Kamerithu project was to create content which had the weight and the complexity and the challenge of the peasants and the workers and their everyday struggles. I'll give a contemporary example of how this manifested last year. Before the protest erupted, I think on the 18th of June, that was the first day of the protests, when the debates on the finance bill were still going on and they were intensifying, a young fellow by the name Mike Mushiri, who's a TikToker and a social media personality with a large following, he decided to break down the finance bill clause by clause in Gikuyu, and he posted it on his TikTok. And that video went viral. And other social media personalities, other TikTokers, they decided to follow suit and take up the task. And so we had all these videos of the finance bill being broken down in Somali, in Borana, in Luo, in Kamba, in Maasai, in Kisii, in all of these languages, right? But the problem, and that was effective, and for me, I still believe to this day that one of the main reasons why we saw the numbers that we saw last year in the streets is because people understood what they're opposing. They weren't there for vibes. They knew exactly what they were opposing. And they knew that because they engaged with this civic education that was being done. But the problem is, since then, most of the analysis that has been coming out, whether it's the articles being written, and I'm guilty of this because I have written some of these articles, whether it's the videos, the documentaries, the forums, they've all been in English, most of them at least, and they've been inaccessible to the masses. So that's something that we need to rectify. The fifth thing, this is my second last thing, is embodying revolutionary praxis. Ngugi was not just a theoretician or a theorist of revolution. He was a practitioner. And I'm sure Yusuf will speak more about it. And he wasn't just a passive member of the December 12th movement and all these other movements. Ngugi was an active member. In fact, I think he was the spokesperson of the December 12th movement. So this is my appeal, and this is my challenge. Join an organization. There's so many progressive organizations in this country. Pick a progressive organization that aligns with your values and your principles and join it. Because joining an organization comes with its own strength. The DTM movement had 3 particular strengths. Number 1, it had ideological clarity. That's something that I think this movement needs more than ever. I don't think we've reached a level where we have ideological clarity, and we desperately need that. So number 1, they had ideological clarity. Number 2, they had discipline. Number 3, they had commitment to action. And all these 3 elements had some sort of dialectical unity. One couldn't exist without the other, right? If you don't have ideological clarity, you're limited to activism. And activism is good, but it's limited. You can't do much with it. You can't organize further than it. That's number 1. If you have ideological clarity, but you don't have discipline, then whatever you're doing, you risk it being mere intellectualism, right? Forgive my language. It's called intellectual masturbation. That's what it becomes, right? It's just you theoretizing too much without any praxis. And if you don't have a commitment to action, then you might easily descend into a sort of elitism or sectarianism, and that's something to avoid. So that's the first element of Ngugi embodying revolutionary praxis. The second element, which again I'm sure will be spoken about much more, is the Kamerithu theatre experiment, right? The great Okot Bitek, he said that the most important event on the African literary and cultural scene in the post-colonial period was the Kamerithu experiment. And when he says that, he doesn't look at it as just cultural work as we know it in certain circles, right? Remember, Ngugi was a Marxist. So the Marxist doctrine of culture as a weapon of ideological struggle is what guided the Kamerithu project. In fact, the play that got him imprisoned, Ngai Kandeda, I Will Marry When I Want, was a direct project of DTM, because both Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ngugi wa Midi, both of them were DTM cell members in Limuru. And that's why the play had the language that it had, and that's why it had the power that it had. And that's why the state crushed it. First Kenyatta, and then later Moi, who raised Kamiritu to the ground. Because the state understood something really important, that radical politics in bourgeois institutions, whether it's universities, professor, whether it's the Kenya National Theatre, because the trial of Dedan Kimathi was before I Will Marry When I Want, and it was also a radical play. But he wasn't imprisoned for it. Why? Because one, it was in English, and two, it was in a controlled bourgeois institution, which is the Kenya National Theatre. But the real threat comes from the alliance between a radicalized intelligentsia and a disgruntled working class or a disgruntled peasantry. So my direct challenge to the knowledge producers, to the intellectuals, to the writers, to the artists, is that don't stay in your high towers, in the high towers of academia, of research centers, of media houses, of studios. Join the struggle and do your part, do what you can. The last thing that I will say that Ngugi wa Thiong'o does for me as a member of the current movement is an emphasis on global solidarity and Pan-African solidarity. On September 6th, 1973, Ngugi wa Thiong'o was in Kazakhstan with a group of African and Asian writers, and he was presented the Lotus Prize in Literature. During his acceptance speech, he opened with a question that W.E. Du Bois had asked, and the question is, what are the links that bind us? Towards the end of that speech, Ngugi says, and I'll quote him directly, that the links that bind us are enduring because as we struggle against the forces which exploit us, oppress us, humiliate us in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Angola, in Rhodesia, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, and in Palestine. Yes, he explicitly mentioned it in 1973. We are truly waging a war against all those forces that exploit, oppress, humiliate, and dwarf the creative spirit of man. For me, Ngugi wa Thiong'o expressed here that he understood the principle that all our struggles are connected, that the struggle against imperialism must be international or else it risks being defeated piecemeal. If oppression is global, shouldn't resistance also be global? As we fight our own fight right now in Kenya, as we push for a better Kenya for all of us, we need to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, in Pan-African solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Congo, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in Haiti, and on a global scale in Palestine and everywhere that faces the brutalities of imperialism. Asanteni.
I had my plan, and then I've just reversed it. I think Kimani will go next, and I'll tell you why. Because he's challenging us about praxis. And I think that we started this with a very practical understanding of Ngugi's take on everyday life that merge theory with practice. I'll just say something here, that these words, dependency, class, imperialism, language, ideology, bourgeoisie, solidarity, revolutionary praxis, these are words that have increasingly disappeared from everyday conversation in this country. There's an entire generation that includes my generation, people who are 50 plus, who will feel offended when you talk about solidarity. They'll feel offended when you talk about class distinctions. They'll feel extremely offended when you talk about imperialism, because they can actually book and access a visa to Britain or America fast-tracked when you have to do 30 days. So that's very revolutionary. You're very old, actually. You understand? You're just pretending to be young here. We'll come back to this. Prof. Now we'll go to Prof. and then Hassan. Star will end because I know that she's going to force here. And so she'll be the last one.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tom. And really thank you so much for what you've just shared with us. So I'll start by indicating my relationship with Mwalimu Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Mwalimu Ngugi was one of my PhD supervisors. I was writing my thesis on the inevitability of dialogic criticism in African poetry and the centrality of dialogue in our understanding of African literature, and that indeed it is necessary for us to see dialogic relations as the essence of our humanity. So that was the work that I engaged with Ngugi by looking at African literature, especially of the oral type. But I was also his student because I took his seminar in comparative perspectives in African literature. So he was my teacher in that regard. I also worked with Ngugi in imagining the first ever Gikuyu journal, Motiri, and as a space for intellectual engagement with African languages and the growth of a certain perspective of linguistic engineering, which was necessary at the time to start imagining how you work online in Gikuyu and so on. And we were able to translate a number of writings, including the writings of Abdulatif Abdallah, Lamin Mazrui, writers from South America. You know, some of the members spoke Spanish and were able to translate this literature into Gikuyu and make it available as an experiment of how languages could speak to each other. And also, as a student, very interested in the politics of our country, providing critical translation of some of the literature and manifestos that were coming to reflect on our country, because I had the facility of Kiswahili as a student of Kiswahili, and therefore I was able to do the translations whenever they were required. And in fact, Ngugi, again, I'm talking about this from a very personal level, the fact that he was able to publish a Gikuyu article in the Yale Journal of Criticism for the first time. The Yale Journal of Criticism would never carry an article not written in a European language. But Ngugi was able to write about the importance of Kiswahili as the language of national consciousness and regional integration. So the article was on the importance of Kiswahili as a national language and as a regional language, but he wrote it in Gikuyu and published it in the Yale Journal of Criticism. And there was, of course, the English translation sitting side by side with the Gikuyu version. So he was a friend, a comrade, a father figure to me, you know, and I learned a lot from him. But I just want to say a few words about his position on language, because this has been of immense interest to me, this question of language, not just as a metaphor of understanding the world, but really as a way of connecting with the people that we want to engage with. So Ngugi saw the connection between language, thought, and cognition generally. And his view was that the language we speak shape our thinking process and the thoughts and the ways in which we engage with whatever we encounter. Now, of course, from a linguistic point of view, these are not new ideas. There was what we call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is basically linguistic relativism on the connection, which started much earlier in the 1930s and 40s. And by 1960s, that connection had been debunked. So people are like, no, you cannot be deterministic. You cannot say that the language you speak automatically determines, the thoughts that you carry. Because otherwise, we would not be able to engage with languages that we do not actually speak and phenomena that we have not encountered because they are predetermined. So we that was challenged. But a much more interesting a much more interesting part is linguistic relativism of the type that is not fully deterministic. You see, to a certain extent, language influences the way we think, language influences the ways in which we interact with the world, and so on. And that language does affect our cognition. And our cognition does, to a certain extent, also affect the languages that we speak, to a certain extent. And in fact, there is now evidence from cognitive linguists showing that there is this connection. So in a sense, therefore, Ngugi's position on the intersection between language and thought and cognition is founded, really, and well motivated by this much more recent, reflection by cognitive linguists that indeed there is that relationship. Now, if this is the case, then, how does Ngugi engage with language? And Kamirithu was really a transformative moment for him. For those of you who've read the earlier works, whether it is, This Time Tomorrow, the play he wrote in the early 60s, late 1950s, Black Hermit, Weep Not Child, A Grain of Wheat, The River Between, and so forth. The position is much more inspired by nationalistic outlook, inspired by Facing Mount Kenya and other literatures that he had grown up seeing, and the possibility actually of a nation, that cannot be subjected to betrayal. But it's in the 1970s, really, that he now built solidarity with the peasants and the workers of Kenya. In a conversation that I had with some of the cast members of Kamirithu, it is clear that, in fact, there was a piece of land that was being grabbed in Kamirithu. And it was very important for the rehearsals to take place in Kamirithu, so that to secure the ground that was going to be grabbed. So we're talking about praxis. It is securing the base. And Ngugi talks about securing the base. You secure the base by working on it, taking possession of it. So immense clarity with Kamirithu, immense clarity with consequent works. He has built new solidarities. He's built solidarities with the workers and the peasants of Kenya. And again, to be clear, in an email that he wrote to me last year, he said that in his imagination, he wanted Kamirithu to be the place that Kenyans can perform plays in whichever language. It does not have to be Gikuyu. You can have performances in the Luo, and that was the imagination, that it is a multilingual space that they were creating, and that Kenyans from all walks of life could actually go and witness this. So the first connection, and the first connection is the cognition and language, and the next connection is workers and peasants. The third connection has to do with epistemological solidarity. So, Africa produces a lot of knowledge. We study the continent and so on. But we package all that in English, in French, in Portuguese, in Spanish, and so on. And there is no connection between the source of the knowledge and the language of transmission. So the argument for linguistic solidarity has to do with a responsibility, an intellectual responsibility for epistemological democracy, in a sense that we should be extracting language, we should be extracting knowledge rather, and giving it back to those that created it in the first place. And that there is a sense of betrayal by some of us who are, intellectuals who would write, but we only write about our people, but not in a language that they would actually access that knowledge. So this solidarity is very, very important for Ngugi. Now, something else that is worth reflecting, and which again was important for Ngugi and in our various conversations, is about the scientification of African languages, the relationship between language and science. Now, if you look at the ways in which nations have developed their science, they have extracted science from other communities. If you look at English got quite a bit of science from Latin, but never stayed locked in Latin. They democratized science through English. The Arabs, the English studied Arabic to enrich their science. That's why you have zero, alchemy, algebra, all that. They studied Arabic, not to be proficient in Arabic, but to extract the knowledge that was available in Arabic and then render it to their communities in English. With regard to Arabic, the Arabs learned Greek, they learned various languages, extracted knowledge, scientific knowledge from those, communities, and turned it into a scientific revolution in Arabic. In fact, a deeper reading of the scientification of Arabic shows the ways in which the Arabic world made strides when language was integrated systematically and deliberately. It was an intellectual pursuit. For Ngugi, the question is, how can we scientifize, how can we make our languages more scientific? Or contribute to the scientification of Africa through languages that are not our languages. And I think that is important also to create a distinction between scientific knowledge and scientific culture. Scientific knowledge can be transmitted in whichever language, but scientific culture can only be transmitted in the language of the majority of the people. That is the position, that if you want to integrate and entrench a culture of science, you must do that in the language of the majority of the people. In the case of Africa, the scientific culture cannot be anchored in foreign languages. It can only be anchored in African languages. That was the position. And it's a correct position, really. That's a correct position. I want to just say, as a wrap-up, something that was also absolutely critical in Ngugi's thinking and which we must pay homage to. And this is the place of translation in enhancing our knowledge and creating a community of a society that is much more understanding, much more caring, and much more democratic. Ngugi felt very strongly that through translation, we can reach out to each other better. We get to understand each other more, and we get to understand our takeoffs. And in fact, he called translation the language of languages. And we saw a little bit of that with English, Kiswahili, and Sheng, and that there was rhythm, literally, as you move from one language to the next. The frustration for Ngugi is that whereas African languages are being translated into English, being translated into Russian, so we have literature being translated, in other foreign languages. I mean, we have quite a bit of that. we do not have sufficient intra-African language translation. So a novel written in the Luo is not likely to be translated into Gikuyu or into Kipsigis or into Somali. And a piece of work written in Kisii is not available in Yoruba or Igbo or Hausa. Ngugi felt strongly that we needed to invest now in intra-African language translations. And that will create certain solidarities because our histories are similar histories. So this is history of slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, and the political betrayals of the post-colonial period and so on. So these histories are similar. And therefore, the investment should really be in that direction. Finally, of course, the relevance of this for this language question. As we were working towards the new constitution, many of us felt that there were certain areas of this country that were not supporting the new constitution. And so my institution took the liberty to translate perspectives of the new constitution into Kipsigis, because we had seen resistance in Kalenjin community, amongst the Kalenjin community. We translated segments of the new constitution into Kipsigis, put that on cassettes, worked with matatu drivers, and sent it to the Rift Valley. We had noticed some resistance in central Kenya. We translated sections of the new constitution, put it in matatus, and worked with matatu drivers and touts, got that into central Kenya, saturated the space. We must absolutely do these things. We must pay attention to language as an instrument of democratization, as an instrument of social justice. We must speak the language of our people. We cannot, we have the facility of multilingualism. You know, engaging in African languages does not imply not harnessing the facility of other languages that we speak. Every language that we speak is important. It depends on the audience that we have. We have different switches in our rooms. When in the sitting room, you switch on the light for the sitting room. When in the bedroom, you switch on the light for the bedroom. We have these linguistic facilities. How are we utilizing them to create better societies and so on? So Ngugi resisted monolingualism. He resisted the hierarchy of languages. He celebrated multilingualism, you know, and he really urged us, for those of us who speak more than 3-4 languages, be able to utilize all these facilities that we have for the service of humanity. Tom, I think I have said what I needed to say today. The rest can come later.
Just again to pick 3 ideas that are important, that if you're in this room and you read Ngugi, the last, I think, collection of essays in his name, which was actually in his honor, is on translation, the language of languages. Pick it up, is in this town. It's affordable, but it's incredible. And I think that what you'd call the political problem in Kenya today is simply because there's a generation that is easily capable of translating political rhetoric into what they feel, what they live. So when the politician says, tuta, my generation would be very much willing to live for the future. The younger generation says, tuna, hatutaki kesho, tunataka saa hii. And that contradiction in that translation is the crisis. And that brings in the second point that you make, which Ngugi makes very well, writers, and this is really annoying in a lot of current writing. Every young African writer says the moment of epiphany. And I find it very annoying. Why are you telling me that you arrived at the moment of epiphany? Why can't you let me read so that I see this moment of epiphany? And this is the good old in the Christian or any religious movement is a transformative moment, the moment of Saul to Paul. And I think that's these guys, the younger generation said, no. We were born today and we are not waiting to be Paul. If you decide to call us Saul, we'll live with it. You understand? That, again, brings in the third point, which is that, that securing the base is very important. Now, 90% of you in this room do not know. Kimani Njogu does know, Hassan knows, and Sitawa knows that this Laikipia Road, from the beginning to the end, was the bachelor's quarters for the University of Nairobi staff. If you are unmarried and you're employed at the University of Nairobi in the 60s and 70s, you lived on this street. I doubt that university, there's still a pocket, some pockets of University of Nairobi staff houses here. Let's not talk about that right now. We might just go to Irungo Houghton's pet subject. Secure the title deeds. So Irungo Houghton, you have a job. What happened when the University of Nairobi staff got married? Or is it we no longer employ people who are not married? And I think that's important. But the last point I want to pick from Prof is that Google's biggest translation project globally, I don't know if it's still based in Nairobi, but it was based here. Google undertook to translate all books published in the world, but pretty much African ones from here. And for years, they've been looking for Swahili translators. At least I know that Mwangi Ribe has been working with them. So on the question of translation, this is something that even the global capitalistic production is interested in. And why? Because, you know, if you want to really read the British Secret Service reports on Tom Mboya, on Jomo Kenyatta, and Oginga Odinga, you have to go to London, when we could just have asked for those reports and translated them, made them available here. So, Mzee Hassan, tafadhali unene yako alafu tumalizie
kwa Kiswahili. Well, thank you so much, Tom. Let me start by thanking Mohamed and Professor Njogu for starting us on this discussion. I would say that I'll be limited to one aspect of Ngugi that is the most uncovered in our country. Ngugi is celebrated as a great writer, an intellectual giant, and as a novelist. And to a certain extent, it appears as if there's a sense of amnesia in Kenya, because Ngugi was a revolutionary thinker and a political activist who spent his entire life fighting against colonialism, imperialism, and new colonialism. And to a certain extent, there is an attempt to bury that part of his life in our society, in our writing, in our talks, the same way as the Mau Mau movement, the Kenya Land and Freedom Movement, was also suppressed and articulated in our society until very recently. Although still much of the studies are from the colonizer's perspective. And I think Ngugi has been very much influenced by the relationship between the colonized and the colonizer. And his experience is intensely focused on the profound impact that the British imperial rule, the British colonial rule had on him as a youngster during the Mau Mau uprising, in which, although he was housed in a privileged, prestigious institution called the Alliance High School, a missionary institution where they were developing the new rulers of Kenya, the minds of the new rulers of Kenya. He came back to Limuru at the peak of the British repressive system against the Kikuyu nation, the Kikuyu nationality. And he directly experienced the destruction of his home village, the death and the destruction. And in this period, the British were able to incarcerate almost the entire population of the Kikuyu nation into concentration camps, leading to thousands of people dying, enormous suffering, terrible humiliation, and so on. And I think that is where I connect with him, in the sense that also, although I was not big enough to experience the colonial experience, I also experienced the brutal side of our new colonial system, given that in the 1960s and the 70s, we had a terrible repressive back from the Kenyan government in northern Kenya, the northern frontier district, where my parents come from, in which the Kenyan government was fighting against what Kenyans know as the shifter war. And I remember the whole neighborhoods in Garissa been razed to the ground, thousands of people in northern Kenya put into concentration camps, the declaration of an emergency, a state of emergency, just like in central Kenya and in Kenya in the 1950s, in the 1960s and onwards, and many of us fleeing our villages and going into exile. And through that exile period, we fled to Tanzania, and I was able to get radicalized by the political changes that were taking place in Tanzania at that moment, exposed to the writings of Mao Zedong, reading the Red Book in Kiswahili. And coming back home here to find also that Ngugi has been writing about the colonial experience, but in the 70s, somehow makes a sharp move from a nationalist position to a commitment, a radical commitment for change. And this is in the 1970s. You see him working with Kamirudhi, moving out from the academic confines of Nairobi University, going to Kamirido. And in all his writings, Ngugi gives a voice, a name, a face, and a radical alternative voice to the Kenyan peasant and the Kenyan working class. And this is a turning point. This is when he abandons his missionary name and truly becomes writing from a nationalist perspective, moves from writing from national perspective to a Marxist radical perspective. And fortunately, we met in London in the 80s, and this is when I had a very close working relationship. I had left Kenya, and I had started, I was at that time working at the BBC in London, but the situation in Kenya was becoming unattainable. We had, Kenyatta had died, we had the attempt coup, we had an intense repressive new colonial system under the Moi regime. And Moi was facing a lot of political opposition from the Kenyan people. And he had reverted to very repressive laws. Political parties were banned, freedom of association, the freedom of movement, the freedom of speech, and media was restricted. And thousands of Kenyans who had come out to oppose the regime were jailed. And Ngugi left Nairobi to come to London to promote one of his books, but he was never to return back. And during that period is when I had engaged Ngugi as a political revolutionary activist. He had come down to London with enormous experience, having organized Kamiridu, having radicalized and changed a lot of things in the University of Nairobi Literature Department, and also had been an active member, although not a founder, of the December 12 movement. And the December 12 movement also had its own publications, and I like to acknowledge people who have actively participated, whom I see here in the audience. Njuki is one of them. He's a custodian of many of this documentation, who has been studying. Only this week he has come back from London, where he visited our headquarters, our political base, the New Beacon Bookshop, which was run by a veteran Black British community leader and a publisher, the late John LaRose, I was glad to hear that the bookshop and the publishing is going under Michael LaRose, his son, and you also met Roxy. Also included in that particular group is a famous Black British poet called Linton Johnson, who is still very active in the political struggles in the Black community in Britain. I also want to acknowledge the presence of Irungu. Irungu was our child as a young Gen Z at that time. In the 60s, had just finished his high school and university, and was one of the people who was always around us in the struggle, and he continues to in that part, which I'm very, very glad. So we set up the first major solidarity group, an advocacy group to oppose the Moi regime and fight for the political prisoners who are detained by the Moi government. It was called the Committee for the Release of Political Parties, for Political Prisoners, sorry, the Committee for the Release of Political Prisoners in Kenya. And Ngugi was a key player in that. Without his presence, there were people like the late Wanjiru Kihoro, Shiraz Durrani, who is also one of the key people behind Ukombozi Library. He is one of the big custodians of our revolutionary papers and our revolutionary activities in those days. There is Abdelatif Abdallah, who is the national poet and the author of Kenya Twaenda Wapi. We had Nish Matenjwa, Wangoi Wagoru, the late Shadrach Kuto, and many others who launched that particular campaign against the Kenya government. At that particular moment in the United Kingdom, Kenya was considered to be the crown jewel of Africa. The British did not believe that anything could go wrong with their former white highland country. It was considered the best African country in terms of democracy. So there's a lot of propaganda. And at that moment in time, also in Britain, Margaret Thatcher had just become the prime minister. And I mention her because she was a great friend of Daniel Arap Moi. She considered Daniel Arap Moi to be the best African leader, and which we completely disagreed with. And in our documentation, we were able to expose the underbelly, the ugly underbelly of the Kenyan government and what it was doing. We had a good relationship with Amnesty International, people like Martin Hill, the late Martin Hill, the Africa Watch, and Rakia Omar, and we were able to write a lot of documentation about the detentions, the killings, the tortures, the corruption, and we had a political platform to engage the British public and the British media. And to a certain extent, we were able to change perceptions in Britain and make it very difficult for the Moi regime to come and tell lies and spread propaganda in the UK. Then we moved on with, again, the advice of Ngugi and the leadership of Ngugi, and we were able to create a political party. And the reason was that in the Committee for the Release of Political Prisoners, we had other people, non-Kenyans, who were willing to support us up to a certain point. But the situation in Kenya was really getting from bad to worse, and we could not stand by. And we were forced to create a vehicle which would articulate the struggles that were going on here, amplify our political program, and tell the world what was happening, and also demand for changes. And that group was called Umoja wa Kupigania Demokrasia. And we had a link from the December 12 movement, people like Ngugi and Shiraz Durrani, who were members of the December 12 movement. Abdelatif Abdallah, who was even beyond, who came before the December 12 movement in the 1960s during the KPU period with Jaramogi Oginga Odinga. And so there was a chain of linkage between the Mau Mau movement during the colonial period to the post-colonial period, where we had KPU and Abdul Latif, the December 12 movement of Ngugi and Shiraz Durrani and others, Kamoji, Washira, Alamin Mazrui, and Ngodo Karaoke, and many others. So this is a continuity of the resistance. Kenya has always been, the Kenyan people have always been people of resistance. We have resisted colonialism, we have resisted neocolonialism, and all these movements are a chain of part of that broad struggle against the repressive systems that we have unfortunately had to live under. And we had very good writers, very good researchers, and we were able to write very interesting and well-researched pieces about what was happening here. And in fact, many of those documents are now very important reference points. And finally, the most important stage of Ngugi's presence with us in London between 1982 when he left to go to the United States is actually the most productive part in the life of Ngugi. During this period, he has been able to write Colonizing the Mind, which was one of the most important books and ideas that has had a great impact not only on Kenya and Africa, but around the world. Because if you look at Ngugi, he has struggled to change his own society in Kenya. He's a Pan-Africanist who's fought for change in the African continent. And the third point also, which connected me with him, is his struggle for a new world system, a global system that is based on equity and social justice. If you look at the place of Africa in the global system, we are in kind of a new colonial stage where we're not there. But Ngugi in his writing has extensively written about that, and has also linked us with solidarity groups internationally. When we're in Britain, we're engaging with the Cuban people, we're engaging with the Palestinian struggle, El Salvador, Guatemala, South Korea, the African struggles that at that particular moment were really very active was the major conflict going in Southern Africa and the anti-apartheid struggle led by the ANC in Namibia, the last remnants of the white settler colonies in South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe were being shaken, and eventually, as you know, that struggle led to the liberation of South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. And we were all actively involved in the solidarity of those particular communities. The only one actually that has not led to victory, and which we're hoping would come on its own time, is of course the Palestinian struggle, which we were very closely involved when we were based in London. And they were also involved in our solidarity committee and in our political communities. In 1986, we moved on further because we were seeking the unity of the left movement, and we were able, Ngugi was able to bring back and bring together under his leadership the formation of 13 political organizations of the left in Sweden, in Denmark, in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, and in Southern Africa. And together we became Umoja, which was the most powerful, probably, left-wing movement of its time. And Ngugi has always been the lodestar, the lightning rod of the Kenyan left movement, and the father figure and mentor of many of us who have been involved in that particular struggle. So I think that it is important to have that in context, is that this did not happen in isolation. It is a struggle that has continued from the colonial period. And surprisingly, when we formed the committee and John LaRose became the leader, we were also joined by C.L.R. James. I don't know whether many of you know about C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James was the academic who wrote the seminal book on the Haitian Revolution. And it's incidentally now Kenya is involved in Haiti. The first black state, independent state, the first black revolution to succeed in the Northern Hemisphere, the Haitian People's Victory. And he was also the chairman of the Pan-Africanist movement, the Pan-Africanist Conference that was held in 1945 in Manchester. And the story he had was that Jomo Kenyatta was in Britain at that moment, and he's one of the participants of the Pan-African Conference in 1945 in Manchester. And Ngugi and I had a conversation with CLR James to find out what kind of a person Jomo Kenyatta was. And he was to tell us that Jomo Kenyatta was a progressive Pan-Africanist. And then we asked him what happened after he became the president of Kenya. He said, that is another Jomo Kenyatta, not the Jomo Kenyatta that we knew in the Pan-African struggle in the 1940s. So obviously some metamorphosis, political metamorphosis had taken place in that process. And then he, surprisingly, was also involved in the Solidarity Committee in the 50s that campaigned against the British regime and promoted and supported the Mau Mau movement. So we had a continuity of the Pan-Africanist struggles in the colonial period of the 1940s, through to the Mau Mau uprising, through to the new colonial. He survived. He died recently, and he was able to tell us that, in fact, there has been no change in Kenya. It's only that the colonial system gave way to a new black leadership, but not the type of independence and liberation that we fought for. And I think that was one of the biggest disappointment and anger that drove Ngugi, that after the savage struggle for independence, in which we lost thousands of people during the Mau Mau, the regime that came into place in 1963 was a betrayal of that. It was not really a true independence, and we had to continue the struggle so that we can have a free, democratic, and just Kenya. This is a struggle that he's put a lot of his effort. One of the things that he did with us as a leader was that we had constant political classes. We had a political school in which we looked at the history of struggles around the world, the relationship to the Kenyan struggle, getting a better understanding of our history. And we did studies. Every member of our community was asked to write about their own community. If you're a Turkana, you did about the Turkana's history, the Luya history, the Kalenjin history, the Somali history, the Kikuyu history in Kenya, the Kamba history, the Mijikenda history, the Taita history, the Oromo history. And by understanding our own history from our own perspective, then we can actually be able to be better prepared for waging the struggle that we're getting into. And when you understand that context of the colonial, new colonial system, then you get a clarity on the kind of struggle that you need to fight for. And that is the Ngugi that I know, who is a mentor, who was a leader, who was constantly campaigning, constantly struggling, constantly writing about the system, and been our best ambassador, political and literary ambassador in the world over the years. And I can say that he has played an incredible role in the freedoms and the progress that we have made so far, fighting for a different Kenya, fighting for a new constitution, fighting for a democratic space. He has created the democratic space that we enjoy now. And I think he's an unsung hero of the second liberation of Kenya. And in the last year, having had some communication with him, he was very excited about the Gen Z movement. He felt that, in fact, our struggle was not in vain, that we have a new generation that is rising up to challenge the status quo. And he felt very, very happy that, in fact, we have not lost everything, given the fact that when we came back from exile here, came back to our country, we felt there was a little bit of a problem with the Kenyan youth, that many of them were not focused on political change. Everyone was chasing after money, chasing after careers, chasing after status. And to a certain extent, we thought maybe the neoliberal system has won and we have lost. But I think there is a great hope among our youth. And I feel that it is a continuation of the struggles that we have waged. And I want to urge the young people to take their historical role, think in terms of the fact that they're the custodians of the future of Kenya, they're the custodians of our revolution. They should learn from the lessons, from the writings of Ngugi and others, so that they can understand their historical role and they can forge a new movement forward. So my message to the young people is that, as Tajuddin Abdurrahman, one of our great socialist thinkers, Pan-Africanist, who unfortunately died in a road accident here many years ago, constantly used to say, don't agonize, get organized. So don't agonize, get organized, act on it, come together, and be the change that you want to be. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yusuf. I mean, a key thing, and I think this is important, it begins from my immediate right here all the way to, I think Sitawa is going to highlight this very much, is that you name and you voice. So if it's tyranny, you name it. And you say it is here. Tyranny is here. If it's repression, you name it and you voice it. And the way you voice it is you write and you publish. And if you publish, you create an archive. And an archive is a reference point for the next set of struggles. So it's not in vain. Today in the morning, I was talking to a colleague and I told him that this is 76 or 77. Edgar Gashukia and Ngugi wa Thiong'o were so worried about the teaching of literature in the school system. So they say, instead of having a beer at the Lillian Towers and agonizing over it, they named it. And they organized a conference on teaching of literature in the education system in Kenya. It was the first and the last conference in this country on teaching of literature in the education system. So I'm not surprised that curriculum writers have progressively erased literature from the education system. Why? Because literature tends to name and voice. It tends to leave an archive that you can't erase. That's what the story is about. And I think what Yusuf has just highlighted here is that we cannot underplay the role of the archive. That's what I was saying, that is incredibly sad that if you really, really want, for example, to understand the trade union movement in this country in the 40s and 50s, you have to go to the British High Commission. And like I told conference attendees at the University of Nairobi this week, if you know your mother's premarital name and you're in this room, raise your hand. If you know the name your mother was called by before she got married to your father, raise your hand. Don't salute me. I used to be a Boy Scout. Some of you, that means that almost half the room will not pass a key question for a visa to the UK. You must know your mother's premarital name. And for many years, this is how the UK made money, because the forms were physical, and they would write first surname, first name, Ney. The word is not pronounced Ney, it's Ney, it's French word, isn't it? N-E-E. And natives used to leave it blank. And you take your form back, and you come back, visa application, rejected. Nowadays, the computer tells you, please, the information above is not fully failed. Then you go back, you see red. And then you call your neighbor and say, what is Ney? And your neighbor says, your mother used to have a name before she got married to your father. Then that's when some of you say, Mommy, send your ID, send your ID. I want your name before you got married to this old guy. Can you imagine? That's how we are judged before we travel. And therefore, to just actually know what was happening in the trade union movement here, you have to go to the British Library in London, right? You go to get that visa. And that's why the archive is important. And one of the reasons the younger generation causes worries, it archives everything. They're archiving everything on the phone, they are sharing, they are putting it on the cloud. In the old days, there are days of these three people resisting. There was only KBC. If KBC didn't announce, you didn't know. Full stop. If Nation, Taifa, Kenya Times, Standard didn't advertise for a job, you didn't know. If you didn't release the news, you didn't know. So please, this moment, I'm actually excited that they're archiving this moment for people who are not here. There are people, you've seen me on the phone, I'm taking my notes, but I'm also sending the link, and there are people who are saying, is it being archived? Can I access it? Silas Nyanchwani, my friend who is in the USA, the other day told me, you guys must learn to archive. Otherwise, you'll just be rattling on. And I'm very sure that when we leave here, you'll be sharing these conversations, and it ends at the beer party, but there are people who will go on to archive and come back and think about this. And one person who told me about the archive is Henrietta Dax Clark. She runs Clark's Bookshop in Cape Town. We had a conference in Wits University, and she said, Tom, lunchtime you are going to collect all notices that have expired on the school boards. I said, Henry, what do you want to do with this notice? She said, somebody will pay me money in 10 years time when they come to do a PhD research on student political activism. And how do I know that she was right? She was right because Malema's ideologue was my student. And he was initially in ANC Youth League, then moved over to another political movement. So to start to think about Malema, you have to go back to that. So thank you very much, Mheshimiwa, for reminding us that the archive is crucial. If you want to change this country, you got to read your history. Thank you. Now, Sitawa, life has been about animating history. If you know her, you know that she animates history. If she speaks to you, she'll speak to you so that you remember what she said. That is how I've known Sita. So when I called her, I said, Sita, would you mind? And she said, Tom, why wouldn't I mind? Why wouldn't I? So Sita, please, this is your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is one of the most enjoyable afternoons I've spent in a long time. So I really appreciate the three gentlemen that went before me, and Tom, yourself as well. This is such a good idea. I come from a different background. I'm not, I have a science background. So I'm coming into theater, the arts much later. So I have gaps. So one of the things that I wanted to do is to take this to the individual level. You've heard the archive, you've heard the importance of language, you've heard everything that's been said, and absolutely critical and really, really, really interesting. And then I want to talk about the individual, the person sitting in your chair. Why bother with all this? Why not just run after money and think about your career, and a lot of people say, there we go again, Africans talking about their history and making things heavy, and let's just have fun. So one of the things that happened to me is that I am that bourgeoisie. There I am in the 60s. My parents, my father goes to Makerere University, the first person in the clan to go to university, and of course begins to do very well when he comes back, and becomes a permanent secretary, etc. And so we are literally stepping into the feet, into the shoes, into the chairs and the houses and the schools of the Mzungus, of the former colonials. And so I've been sent to Ora Drummond Kindergarten, just in case some of you have heard about it, as a probably 4 or 5 year old, without any preparation. We are the first, my sister and I are the first, we like to believe, the first Africans, we can't remember anything else, the first Africans in the school. So we've been put into the hands of our former colonials. Do you think they liked us? I don't think so. So whatever time I spent there, I have no idea how long it was. I remember nothing. I went there as a little Bukusu girl who spoke Bukusu, came out as a little Bukusu girl who spoke Bukusu, but the instruction was in English. And I then go to the next horror. So horrific experience, which is Kilimani Primary School, which is at that time, again, 90% Mzungu. They were fleeing, so by the time, after a few years, the Africans and Asians were the majority, because I later discovered that is called white flight. But again, we're put into the hands of our former colonials. Nobody explains anything to us. Our parents don't sit us down and say, you were colonized and, we're giving you the best and it's going to be rough and we're sending you there to decolonize physically. So again, lots of trauma around that situation. So we'll proceed, go to Nairobi University. I have a lot of questions, all this stuff coming at you as an African child. You're being told, Speak discovered this mountain, and Livingstone discovered that lake, and etc. And you're sitting there in class thinking, but then what were my grandparents, great-grandparents doing? Were they walking around with their eyes closed? But you dare not ask anybody because everybody's busy. My parents are busy building the nation. These Mzungu, same Mzungu teachers are not going to, you'll get into trouble, you get into detention if you dare ask, right? And so you're just swirling with all these questions, all these concerns. You're told you can't speak your language. And but if the French child who has just come in speaks French, you have to speak English, but the French child who comes in and speaks French, there's no problem. In fact, everybody's admiring this child. But you're getting seriously punished and shamed by when you speak your language and you're put in a corner or you're put in a sack or whatever it is that happened to you, which apparently was a little bit better than what happened to the children in Canada and the native children in Canada and America in the residency schools who had a nail put into their tongues if they were caught speaking their language. So you've a whole lot of questions. You're radicalized. Actually, the environment is also radicalizing you, but there are no answers. There's no coherent answers. The history that is taught is terrible. We were always losing. We lost everything, and I'm sitting there annoyed at my people, thinking, why are you people why didn't you fight? Why didn't you fight back? Why did you allow yourselves to lose all the time? Because then the Mzungu kids are telling you, my little friend, when we quarreled, she was called Kim, told me once when we had a fight, the British saved the world. And I looked at it and I said, what are you talking about? And I said, all I could say was, who asked them anyway? I have very little to say back because clearly my people didn't do anything. So then eventually I read Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind. We've had Ngugi in school, etc. But the book that really, really just put everything together for me, put the fragments that I had been created for me together, was Decolonizing the Mind. And when I did become a writer 18 years ago, I wrote an article celebrating Ngugi and talking about that. And the last line said, Ngugi gave me back my vision. An incredibly powerful thing. Because I also had gone to Nairobi University to study science. and there is no, all your wonderful experiences. We're learning science when there's very little African context. There's very little theory that you can understand. You're just told, okay, this is science, and that's it. So coming out, finding this book was an amazing experience. It put everything back together for me, and gave me a template to continue. Because of course, you're always searching for yourself, to continue searching for myself. And what's the point? What's the point about searching for yourself? What does it do, Because a lot of people think it doesn't mean anything. So one of the things that I've been doing recently is working with Storymoja to develop historical fiction books for African children aged between 11 and 14. And in that process, we train editors. So young Kenyans who come in, and we spend, several months training them in editing. But the first thing we have to do is to help them believe in themselves, because they come in and have got total disrespect for African history, for their own culture, for themselves. So when we're saying we're looking for stories that that we're going to write, and they've got to be dramatic and wonderful and amazing, they don't believe that those stories exist. So in the beginning, when I talk to them, when we start working with them, they're all thinking, oh, the American West. I want stories about the American West, about Napoleon, etc. And then slowly we begin to share with them and get them to understand and to see, we have, Mekatilili, of course. We have the Ajuran Empire, which was an amazing empire. We have a whole lot of stories that have the adventures and that could be made into amazing films. And then, but we have to deal with the person themselves. We have to first of all, deal with who they think of them, who they are, what they think of themselves, what they think of Africanness, because we have been indoctrinated, and it produces a certain subtle self-disregard that continues. Unfortunately, our educational systems continue to continue the work of the work of the colonizer, because one of the wonderful people that I really admire is Steve Biko, who says who has this wonderful quote that says, the best weapon in the mind of the best weapon in the hands of the colonizer is the mind of the colonized, isn't it? Yeah. Ngugi, again, in Decolonizing the Mind, has a very similar statement, which again I really like. Yeah. So it's amazing when you're dealing with trying to do something that should seem so normal, but then becomes so radical and so difficult. You can't get to the writing of the books, you can't get to conducting the research until you have dealt with a human being that is actually going to do that. And one of the other things that I've noticed is the impact of these young people beginning to recognize who they are, getting their history and realizing that we have glorious history. Of course we do, yeah? In the beginning, they're very shy, very, self-contained, the way they hold their bodies, how they look, the language they use about themselves, about Africans, every so often a sense of embarrassment. If I start singing, yeah, they're like, oh my goodness, that's not what is done in public, it is what we do in private. Because of course there is the public African and then the private African. And then beginning to put those together. And I think it's so important when we talk about, I see all this talk about STEM, promoting science, technology, mathematics, etc. And I think, how can you promote STEM when the person who's going to become an engineer doesn't have the confidence or the ability to look and see their immediate environment as valuable, as important, and find solutions for their mother who is still walking, or grandmother who's still walking to fetch water from a river. You need to equip with that person, first of all, with the self-knowledge and self-confidence and self-awareness to understand that their community is important, and they can apply their scientific knowledge to find solutions to the problems that surround them and their people who are valuable, who are as amazing as anything. Yeah. So, for me, Ngugi has been so instrumental in really opening my mind. I'm not sure I would be here. I think I'll probably be hanging out at Muthaiga Club, doing the things that he described. If I hadn't had this amazing experience and a transformation of the mind, because of course you're concerned, but you don't know where to go to find the answers to the questions that you have. And I think, I'm sad to hear that only that one conference was held, because I think it's incredibly important to have a list of books that should be mandatory to be read by every African, so that we as Africans know ourselves, can appreciate ourselves. When I was in these schools, I was taught that to be an educated person wasn't about getting a degree, was to make sure that you could quote. You had read, there's a list of books you should have read. Of course, Shakespeare, of course, Charles Dickens, etc. And you still hear it. I still hear it, particularly among lawyers, when they're trying to sound erudite. They'll be like, and as William Wordsworth said in his poem, even just listen to them. Even last week I heard it. So and nobody and Latin words to make that nobody knows, that to make nobody understands, to make it. Yes, exactly. So I would love, imagine if today we're still saying, I would love to hear them quote Ngugi wa Thiong'o, rather than, because I promise you, I've read him extensively, and there are amazing things that he says that can be used in a court case in Nairobi right now. So really, with that, I'm going to stop there and just say that, and just end that it is about the energy that you unleash in yourself. So when I start working with these young people, they're like this, and have no initiative. I'm waiting to be told what to do. So this is not a joke. This is urgent. By the time we finish with them, they're like, oh my goodness. When I matter in the world, they matter in the world. They recognize I matter in the world. My ideas matter in the world. My actions matter in the world, and I can do something to transform this situation instead of complaining. Thank you.
That's it. So if you doubted my arrangement, now you understand the spirit was here. The two gentlemen, these are children, later on friends of Ngugi. The lady there and the young man here, these are Ngugi's spiritual children. If you doubted that Ngugi's spirit was seated here, or is still seated here. But let me just say something about Sitawa. What Sitawa is saying is very important. What are you reading, and who are you reading? This is important. I was making a presentation the other day and said, it's not accidental that the societies we grew up in, the mother or the grandmother actually told you the stories of the society, because they are the closest people to you. They're extremely close to you. Today, mothers often make a phone call and say, has he done the homework? And that's where the homework still says that somebody wants to go to the Alps to see snow and drink milk from Alp mountain goats, right? One of the great things, if you go to Kempinski, is that they'll tell you this cheese which is derived from milk from mountain goats. This is important. This is, I had a running joke. I used to teach, and there was a student in class who was more intelligent than I was. And she would always mock me. She would always say, "You don't know." Until one day I discovered something she didn't know. And she didn't know what guacamole is. And on that day, I was extremely excited. And how did I discover that avocado is called guacamole? I went to Kempinski. And in Kempinski, they give you vegetables from Mount Kenya. They say vegetables grown at the foot of Mount Kenya, fresh air, sauteed tomato. Sauteed tomato is what? It's just, not tomato, potatoes, sauteed potato, with a dash of guacamole. It means that the avocado is so tiny, you understand? So when I was there, I called the waiter and said, "What's guacamole?" He said, "Avocado bwana." When namna gani? Huh? So I went to school and I taught that day the spirit was in me and I was in the spirit. And then I asked the young girl, "What is guacamole?" And she was nice enough. I mean, she teaches in Ethiopia now. She teaches English in Ethiopia. She said, "That one you got me today." You can't imagine how much I ate that day and drank that day, because there was self-discovery. And that's important. It's really important. I think actually Ngugi insists on that. You just have to have self-discovery. I'll tell you why self-discovery is important. This week, the university has been asking us to fill forms indicating which school you went to, primary and secondary. And I have never known, I still need to know why every time I tell people that I went to a school called Obinju Kanyakwar, people laugh. I don't know, because it's a school I really treasure. And they laugh for two reasons. One, they don't know that Obinju is actually a flower. So when they laugh, I laugh at them, it's out of ignorance. They don't know that Kanyakwar is a very important place in Kisumu, which is what Ngugi asks us to do. But then I think the last and very important thing that then Ngugi says, which Sitawa tells us, gathering things and putting them together. This is important. We have refused to gather the history of this country and put it together. Because if we gather and put it together, we'll be able to understand what these guys we elect. My house has a home in Kisumu and a home somewhere in Murang'a called Kiriaini. Okay, so if I go to Kiriaini on the way as I drive, I ask my co-driver, why are all these people called Wamatangi, Wamaziwa, Wamisumali? You understand? Wamashukuru, you understand? And the thing is this is the politicians' language, which the young people have refused. Say, no, the tanks you give us is our money. The milk you bring is our milk. You don't have cows to, because the young people have gathered the metaphors. And they sit and they pose to each other and say, decipher this metaphor. That's why you are saying, somebody actually took the financial bill and analyzed it and said, if you vote here, your grandmother will not have a blanket. If you vote this one, kibiriti na chumvi, bei itaenda juu. Two things whose prices hardly go up. Kibiriti na nini? Na chumvi. Hello. Okay, self-discovery, the last thing, anecdote. Do you guys know that the price of cocaine in America has never increased for the past 40 years? Yeah, because they use a simple economic principle. The more you sell, the more money you make. You don't need to increase the price to increase the profit. You just need to have more recruits. So it's never risen. The basic price of cocaine has never risen. And the way you want to know that's true, this Kilimani primary school you're talking about and Kileleshwa, there are people who sell sweets around here, and those sweets are dipped into cocaine. Just like I'm very sure you know that the reason Muguka has replaced Mira is because it's cheap, right? But it's put in a bucket. And that bucket has water, supposedly to keep it what? Fresh, but it has a dash of cocaine. That's why the price of cocaine will never go up, because the customer base increases every other day. Hata wewe ukiwa na customer wengi utapandisha bei. So ladies and gentlemen, this has been extremely thrilling. I can see the director of BIE here. I haven't seen the director of RVIE here and French, but I think we are going to demand that we must have this, and I must have more of this. I've opened it up for discussion. You can stand up and sneeze in your language and speak in your language. We have interpreters here. Gen Zs are here. AI tools are here. Oh, Sitawa is here. Was there anybody in the room who understood the Bukusu quarter song she sang? That's the point. So when she leaves here, tell her to sing the whole song. Yes, I've opened it up for discussion. Just demand the microphone. It's yours. These are your taxes.
Yes, tusimame ama tuongee kama tumeketi. Okay. Mimi ni Mumia Osaji na tunafundisha na Tom Odhiambo, University of Nairobi. Kwanza nawashukuru Mheshimiwa Yusuf bin Namwalie Sitawa, Profesa Njogu Kimani na ndugu yangu Mohamed Shukri kwa hamasisho na mshawasha ambao mmetuletea siku ya leo. I now move to English because that's where I profess. Sometimes at the University of Nairobi, before we joined, there was a very interesting debate that used to go on there. Basically, it related to whether you dreamt in your mother tongue or you dreamt in English. And if you dreamt in mother tongue, you are said to be decolonized. And the inverse was true. And then there was the mode of dressing. Those people who appeared in African kitenge, floral kitenges, or in what they used to call the counter suits, were considered radicals. And Ngugi belonged to both camps. He was dreaming in vernacular, in his mother tongue. Sorry for using vernacular as a term. We have decolonized vernacular, so we use native language, indigenous language. And he was also known for dressing in African kitenge. Now, going back to the essays, because much of what we've been discussing here is anchored in his essays. That's where he articulated his theories. That's where he articulated his radicalism. I have read Ngugi up to doctoral level because I have a doctorate on Ngugi's essays. And I noticed something, that he is not just an icon. He's not just a monument. Ngugi is actually an institution, because I quoted him in a title, and UNESCO and Ford Foundation gave me an express ticket to go to Canada to participate in a conference and present there. So that's when I knew that just by citing Ngugi, you can go places. So he's an institution. Now, having said that, I have some little qualms about him, and probably because this is an open discussion, you may join me in reflecting on this. There is a measure of stridency in Ngugi's essays. A professor at Ngugi's level, and professor, you may probably disquiet me on this, you expect a little bit of nuance in claims that you make. You leave room for doubt. I rarely see Ngugi's inclination towards nuance, especially in his essays. If you look at the thematic impulse he gives on the Mau Mau question, you feel that it is more of a romantic engagement with the Mau Mau. Yet we know that besides sacrificing their lives for independence, which is a plus, because some of us are alive because of them, but Ngugi has over-romanticized the Mau Mau by not mentioning some of the excesses they indulged in. And then there is the question of language also. I think it cuts both ways. One is that we have celebrated the issue of him being a bulwark against what we have just been discussing in 2 consecutive seminars at the University of Nairobi, international seminars, ACLALS and ALA. Professor was a presenter in one of the conferences. And we were talking about Englishes and linguicide. And Ngugi is a bulwark against the genocide against indigenous languages. But while he's prosecuting this thrust to protect, reinforce, and revitalize these indigenous languages, there is a possibility that he might be misinterpreted as someone who is promoting hegemonic tendency. The same hegemony of English that he is fighting against can be turned, the coin can be turned against him. So these are some of the things that I would want us to reflect on. Yeah, thank you.
This one here.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be as brief as possible. Erokamano. That's my language. My name is Barak Odur. I am a journalist. For the past week, there's something that struck me. On 25th June, when I went for coverage during the protest, the first thing that I saw was the barbed wire that was placed around Parliament. The first thing that came to my mind was how Ngugi was describing how the British colonialists were treating the Gikuyu community and the Hembu, especially the concentration camps that were in central Kenya. Then I began thinking the way things changed, the way they remain the same, like since Kenya got independence over 60 years, the same things that were happening are the same things that we are seeing. I would love to hear from the panelists their perspectives. If Ngugi was still alive today, what would you have said about that particular fence that we saw that was erected to block the protesters from accessing Parliament and basically the CBD of Nairobi that day? Thank you.
And please, feel free to respond to somebody else. It's these people are not employed. In fact, they are hungry. They came here before lunch. I hear they are snacks, so they'll be the first one at the snack. So if somebody provokes you, feel free to respond. You understand? You can even swear in Turkana. We'll just keep quiet.
Okay, hello. I'm Mickey Muchowa. I guess I'll describe myself as a designer, but I speak about design as a world-making practice. I am from Kisumu, and I run an organization that focuses on restoring Lake Victoria and Kisumu to its pristine condition. So something that was said earlier really struck me, where you spoke about a scientific culture needing to be dispersed in the language of the people. So my first question, because I've had a lot of incidences working on Lake Victoria where you have a scientist that comes in, they conduct their scientific studies, then they go, but they are all published in English. So local people could never understand them. And even when we would engage the scientists, they would specifically speak in technical language to prove they are smarter than you, quite literally, like you don't know what you're talking about. So I think my question is, who is our science for? Because you made me realize that the English specifically learned other languages so they could extract knowledge to improve their societies. So who is our science for? Who is our writing for? If we're writing it in languages that we know are inaccessible to our communities. Yeah, that's my question.
Hi. Around like 30 years ago, or something like 30 give or take, an uncle of mine did a PhD on Ngugi, and he was trying to get all these like original papers by Ngugi, and it was really hard to like trace them. But then like for whatever reason, he decided like let me just like reach out to Ngugi himself, ask him, can I read your papers, right? And Ngugi receives his message and he's like, just come to my house. The papers are in my house. You can just like stay in my house and read them, right? And so my uncle goes to Ngugi's house and he's there for like a few days, just like reading through the papers and asking the direct questions to the person writing the PhD about. And it was like this idea of like someone who, despite like the station he occupied, was like really generous to like people who were, so to say, his inferiors, right? And then 30 years after this PhD, I decided that I'm going to like also write something about Ngugi. And I talked to him about it, and he's like, can you just like come and stay in my house? You know? And whereas like I think like the mode for like interviews, like you'll go to like a cafe with someone for like 2 hours or 3 hours, right? Ngugi is like, just come and be my housemate, right? And I interview him for like the course of 3 days. And at some point, he's helping me with my interview because he's like, you haven't asked me about this. Okay, ask me about this now, right? At some point, it's like, okay, you clearly know nothing about DTM. So I'll pretend you asked me about DTM and I'll tell you things about DTM, right? And I'm in this like strange position where like, I think at a certain point, like, I imagine that like Ngugi like wanted an hegemony of like language, especially when you're writing, like you're writing your mother tongue, right? But in this position where like I'm there, I'm like a writer from Kenya, yeah, but I'm writing for like a British newspaper in English. And that is like the point, and I think I'm also responding to like what Dr. Saji said. I realized that like, he was never, the idea for him was never that like you have to write in like one set language, right? The idea for him was that like it was a terrible thing that like all these people were being trained to only write in a colonial language, right? And it was fine if you wanted to write in like English or French or whatever, but it also had to like write in Kikuyu or Hausa or Igbo or Amharic, right? And I remember at the point I was leaving his house, he was like, you know, like, yeah, sure, you're going to write this article for The Guardian and it's going to be in English or whatever, but like also like write in English. No, write in Luo. And I think at that point I told him that like, I said something like, I like Luo so much that like if I was writing in Luo, I would be a musician in Luo because I think music is better than like writing. Yeah, and like the last thing I would say, so I read all these things about like Ngugi, whatever, and like, sure, I also wrote a thing about Ngugi, and like he's always like, Ngugi is like serious, revolutionary, radical, thinker, intellectual. In the space of like that, like 3 days I was in his house, the lasting thing that like made the biggest impression on me was like how much he liked stupid jokes, like really silly jokes. Like, you know, there's a writer called Okay Ndibe, and like one time I'm on the phone with Ngugi, and Ngugi is like hanging out with Okay, and he tells Okay, oh, okay, you should tell this young man how you're doing. And Okay just laughs, and Ngugi is like, oh, it's because he doesn't want to say he's doing okay, you know? And yeah, and it's like a thing like I wanted to just like let everybody know that like, you know, he's like serious and intellectual and radical, but also like he had some really stupid jokes.
Oh, thank you. My name's Mark Hamko. I'm a graduate student at University of Nairobi. This is a very good point which the panelists have raised of studying history, which Mohamed had started by raising it. And I have very few concerns to tell. Now, Mohamed, you're aware that history is being taught at, yeah, yes, yeah. So, Mohamed, you're aware that history is being taught at university level and most of our schools. Now, my question is, what should be done so that history is raised above the bar? Then to the panelists, do you foresee a revolution taking place in Kenya? What is the conversation? So I'll be happy.
We're just going to have to come back here because this thing was timed to end at 4, and we're moving on. I think we'll just stop it at around, even for 4:30, and there are snacks. So just don't make sure they don't go away. I know Mheshimiwa might be going to a committee meeting somewhere, but make sure he doesn't go away. Sitawa doesn't go away. Yeah, for family. We are the new family, so just make sure. So, Mheshimiwa.
Well, thank you so much. I just wanted to comment on the academician. And Ngugi was actually, and I'm surprised you had actually written your thesis about Ngugi, and ended up with that kind of a colonial perspective. Ngugi was influenced by Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon had said this about colonialism is just not a political and economic system, but also a psychological one. It aims to dehumanize the colonized, leading to inadequacy, self-hatred, and desire to like the colonized. And I think to a certain extent, you seem to have a distorted perception of identity and culture in that sense, because, for example, on the issue of language, I think I have an eminent expert here, so I should be careful, is that there is nothing radical or out of this world about demanding one individual who was colonized and who has lost his name, his religion, and his culture to go back to his indigenous language. It's just a no-brainer, you know. And when Ngugi abandoned English and started promoting writing in Gikuyu, there were people who renounced him because they said, oh, he's promoting tribalism. And I know Ngugi very at a very close range. He was an ethnic blind. He didn't believe in ethnicity. He was a progressive African who thought above that. It is great for the Gikuyu nation to write its own language. And I see it now with social media and television that is becoming a reality. People are going back to their language, their pride in their language. And because I've always spoken at home in Somali, I've always had a great pride in my language. And it is not just a political and economic subjugation. The colonizer takes over your mind and turns you into some kind of a robot, believing in, and that's why we need to change our textbooks. We need to change our educational system because we've all been brainwashed. Why would Ngugi have a nuance? His community suffered intensively. If you have read Carol Elkins' analysis of the Mau Mau. And by the way, the archives have been trashed. The British destroyed half of the archives. They burnt them or they dumped them into the sea. The most serious aspect, the most savage aspect of the British colonial system has been wiped out. You wouldn't find that in any archives. They got rid of it. Fires were burning in British offices towards December 1963. Huge chunks of these documents were destroyed. So through oral history, Carol Elkins was able to reconstruct the history of the Kikuyu people during this very bleak time. Why would he be a neutral person in the struggle for this society? And why would you be interested in the excesses of the Mau Mau? What pleasure would it give you? Because it is always the argument that is used in British argument, this was a savage black organization that brutalized the African people. How many Mau Maus, how many British people were killed by the Mau Mau? Very few. How many people did the British kill? Do we write about that brutalization of the African people? No, we don't. Do we mourn the terrible excesses of the British government every year? Do we commemorate as Kenyans? We don't. In other societies, every year they commemorate the atrocities of the colonial system. Even in the United States, you would have a constant celebration of independence and the war against the British colonial rule. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know what is wrong with us in terms of. So my brother decolonized your mind, and then on the other thing is I would say that Ngugi was a people's writer. All his if you read both his fictional writing as well as his non-fiction, he articulated the voice of the people. It's actually the story of the people. Ngugi didn't take any position. And even politically, Ngugi was selfless. And I like that anecdote from the young person. He was very humble, down-to-earth person. You wouldn't think he was a professor. And because of the way he dressed, I mentioned in the University of Nairobi speech that there was one incident. I was in New York, and we were attending one of his speeches. Is that we arrived too late. It was at the New York University, and there was a long line snaking around the building, hundreds of people wanting to get in, and we had come late. So we thought maybe we wouldn't get entry into the hall to listen to him, but we found him at the gate, and he was dressed in that kitenge, trademark kitenge, his unkempt hair. He was looked kind of scruffy, and the security guys, the ushers, didn't recognize him, although he was the keynote speaker of this event. And so we hung around with him, and then the university authorities came and took us to another gate, another door. And we were ushered in into the VIP section with him. So we were able to listen to him. And I've seen him speak in many places around the world, in London, in New York, in Johannesburg, here in Nairobi, in Asia when I was working out there. His ideas are all very refreshing. He always has a refreshing, exciting way of presenting his ideas. Authentic. He's an authentic voice, because it is not something that comes from his head. He transmits the aspirations of the Kenyan people, the African people, the have-nots of the world. And he is celebrated in this event. He had a standing ovation. You know, a prophet is not honored in his own land. And I'm saddened that, in fact, he passed away without his alma mater, his former University of Nairobi, ever giving him any honor. No doctor. He's received hundreds of doctorates around, honorary doctorates around the world, and he's never been honored at the University of Nairobi. Isn't that not a shame? It's a big shame. Yes, and he was our brand, our best brand, and our best face in the world. So I think what I would like to say is that outside, he was celebrated not only for his writing, but for his theories. He's been a major figure in rethinking, reviewing, and working on global issues from an African perspective. His issues on decolonization, decoloniality, language, and culture, as has been said here. He is one of a kind that we have never had. And I want to say that his place in history is secure. He would always be remembered in our hearts and in our minds in future generations. And I think I would also say that we would continue to pursue, and I now see that young people are pushing for change. His ideas would continue to live on, and it is not always easy to predict revolutions. Revolutions happen, but I can tell you now, we have never been in such a revolutionary moment than any other time in our history. So it may happen, it may not happen in the next 4 or 5 years, but if we do not make fundamental changes in our governance system and our political system, in our democratic system, it is inevitable we're going to have a revolution in our country. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It's just a question of time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yusuf. I mean, you've answered the questions, but I just want to footnote, just a couple of footnotes. So, should Ngugi be more nuanced in his essays or not? I think it's about positionality, because nuance implies ambiguity and lack of clarity. Ngugi was absolutely clear about the destiny of our country and the direction that this country has actually taken. So in terms of his essays, it's a position he has taken that really we cannot continue in the same political and economic dispensation that we have had over the last 60 years. There's a betrayal of the Kenyan people, that the quality of leadership is mediocre, that there's corruption, there's land grabbing, that there's no accountability. I mean, that you don't need to be nuanced to be able to take that type of, it's about clarity. And I think that as one does not, I think one can just admire. I do not think that to be a scholar implies that one has to be nuanced and one has to be ambiguous about the position they take. If you take someone like Noam Chomsky, and his position about world politics, about the ways in which we live and global oppression, economic injustices, and so on and so on. It's about clarity. So I want to admire Ngugi's position and to say that the lack of nuance is absolutely commendable in terms of his essays. It's a manifestation of his total commitment, the transformation of our country, for the benefit of the majority of our people. The romanticization of the Mau Mau struggle, I don't think so, really. I think that we have read his works rather deeply, whether one is talking about Weep Not Child, A Grain of Wheat, Matigari, Petals of Blood. I mean, the Mau Mau phenomenon is a constant. And one does also appreciate the complexity of the struggle. I mean, you don't even need to go very far to see how he handles, A Grain of Wheat. Whether one is talking about Gikonyo, one is talking about Karanja, and all these other things that actually happen in that novel. So again, I don't see him romanticizing. I see him taking Mau Mau struggle as point of reference, for his work. And one must read the Mau Mau struggle both in terms of inspiration, but also as lived reality and lived, experience. Especially if you read also his recent memoirs and see the ways in which, whether it's Wallace, his brother, or his other brother who gets shot, because he's told to stop and he's deaf, and and he can't stop and therefore gets killed, and so forth and so on. I think that Ngugi does not romanticize. I think what he does, he draws on the history of Mau Mau and the issues of land and freedom to articulate a possibility of a fairer nation, possibility of a just society. I think that I don't want to deal too much about the hegemonic question and language and so on. Just to encourage you to read his essay. There is an essay that he wrote when he was giving the Neville Alexander lecture at Harvard. And it's basically about his celebration of multilingualism, and the fact that we must celebrate the multiplicity of languages that exist in the world, and that actually to resist diversity, to resist our uniqueness and our various experiences is to be poorer. That indeed to be human is to celebrate this diversity. And multilingualism is the norm, globally. And monolingualism, the celebration of monolingualism, even within educational institutions, is actually an anomaly. And I think that he is, even as he celebrates African languages, he's also encouraging us to reach out to other languages in the world and to get those languages, extract knowledge, but make it useful to the communities that we work in. Very quickly, who's science? As we said, you need both this knowledge in science, but you also require scientific culture. The Japanese have it, the Koreans have it, Germans have it, the French have it, the English have it. They have scientific culture. Africa requires a scientific culture in African languages. We must produce science that benefits our people. And the way it will benefit our people is how we transmit it. One of the ways we've been trying to encourage the scientists to pay particular attention on the communicative component of their research. It is very unlikely that the scientists will do it because we need a total, complete curricular reform, in our institutions, both at all levels of society, educational system, whether it's high school and universities, complete reform to make our science much more communicative and much more relevant to our society. In the absence of such curriculum reform, we need an intermediary platform which turns the science into consumable products, so that we are the links to our communities. We take the science and reorganize it completely for the benefit of our people. Now that second level requires a certain set of skill sets, which I think that the younger generation can actually cultivate, so that the younger generation become the intermediaries between the scientists who are doing all sorts of things in the labs and the communities that require that scientific production. We are trying to do that through the technical and vocational institutions and so on, but we need to be much more deliberate and aggressive in doing this. And I think that we will not technologize as a country, as a continent, until we inject into our system the scientific culture and the technological culture that is required to do this, so that we carry the majority of our people with us. We will continue with scientific and technological dependence until we build this culture. I think the younger generation through Sheng, I celebrate Sheng. I think that the younger people are doing it through Sheng. They're doing it through other modes of appropriation of the technologies and really, turning things around. But without political will, this will just be ad hoc. That's why you need political power that supports this scientification of African languages and the connection of our people. Without political will, we cannot succeed. It is going to be ad hoc. You require political will, you require the power that allows you to put, resources in the right places, that reforms our educational system, that reforms the ways in which public officers work, that they become more accountable to our people and so on. And that our intellectual work is not just intellectual work for its own sake. It's intellectual work that seeks to resolve the challenging problems that our societies have, whether it's in medicine, whether it is in transport, whether it's in water, whether it is, all these other spaces. Commitment does not just happen. It must be very deliberate, organized, and it calls for a new set of people, really, in administration, in leadership, that feel deeply about the need for us to change our country. So I am here, I was in Kisumu. We were trying, as public intellectuals, what we did was to gather university lecturers and professors in Kisumu to identify the critical concerns in Kisumu County and to come up with the possible solutions. And I was there for 3 days, earlier on. What are the critical questions that need to be resolved? And what solutions do you have as intellectuals located in this community? And they did come up with some possible solutions. But of course, you could see still university level, not community driven.
Okay, thank you very much. First, one of the most important things that I've understood in my life is that we are all colonized. Every single one of us, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're the global majority or the other ones, we're all colonized. And before I used to point fingers and look at superficial things like dressing or dreams or whatever, we're all colonized. We've got a lot of work to do. And that work is continuous and it's also generational. So each generation does its work, the next one picks up and does its work. And that's part of the reason history is so important. So you know what is the work that you need to do. So I no longer point fingers. I look at my own, what are my colonized ways? Because I've got lots of colonized ways that I need to deal with and to deal with it on an ongoing basis. Right now, my concerns are the colonized of the Western white people who I fear may decide that they're going to wake up that colonizing thing where they're going to come and start colonizing as everybody again. And that's not a vague fear, because you're seeing Donald Trump wanting to colonize Greenland and Denmark and I don't know where, Canada, etc. So it's a real concern. So we're all colonized. I think the other thing is that I've been in rooms. I had a 25-year career in development, in the development industry. And I've been at the table and experienced how difficult it is to talk to scientists, to talk to engineers about ordinary life. We had a World Bank project that was building roads in Kayole, and we had to be very careful when we did a study on who uses the roads. So you have to be careful because the scientists, the engineers are going to get upset when you start talking about the number of men, the number of women, in other words, gender. They don't want to hear that. They want to build a road and they don't want to know about, and they want to place the lights where they want to place the lights. They want to place whatever it is where they want to place, the footpaths, etc., the things that bridges, etc. And so we had to use very careful language when we did the study and discovered that there's incredible differences. Young men use those roads in different ways to older men, to young women. By 6 o'clock, women ages of 50 are not on the roads because they are in their houses because of lack of security, etc. Imagine all that, and yet roads are used by who? People.
Naona tunazimiwa stima, so let me do it as brief as possible. On the question that you raised about history, right? It's something that one of Ngugi's characters raises in Shetani Msalabani. I think it was Gatwira. He illustrates the historical deficit within his generation so well when he says that the tragedy of his generation is that it has nowhere to go to learn the history of our country. Now, on the how, two things. Number one, do the work. You mentioned the university being the institution of learning history, right? The work here is decenter the university, decenter the bourgeois institutions, seek alternative institutions. Both Yusuf and I, and even Prof Kimani mentioned Ukombozi Library, right? There are other institutions where we have rich history, the real history of Kenya. Ukombozi Library, Mashujaa Heritage, and so on and so forth, right? So seek out these alternative institutions, go there, study. They even have political education sessions. They study in cells. I don't know if they brought it back every Monday evening. They brought it back. Okay, yeah, every Monday evening they used to meet at around, I think, 5 o'clock at Ukombozi. And the first lesson was studying history, right? Because our history has been bastardized. Number two is the cadres of these movements, some of whom are here with us in this room, who participated in the DTMs and the Makenyas and so on and so forth. Kazi kwenu pia, seek out the young people and teach them this history. On the question of revolution, the seeds of liberation and the seeds of revolution, they're usually planted by those who don't live long enough to harvest it, right? So don't think of yourself as, oh, I'm going to be the one to, reach the goal or the end goal of the revolution. You have to view yourself as something larger than yourself. You have to be very selfless and view yourself as something that is way beyond yourself. Ngugi was a disciple of Frantz Fanon. There's that famous quote that Fanon says that every generation must, out of relative obscurity, do what? Discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it, right? These folks that you see here, Prof Kimani, Yusuf, Sitawa, Njogu, Dr. Tom Odhiambo, all of them, they discovered their mission, they fulfilled it, they didn't betray it. So it's up to us as a generation to carry on that and pass the baton on to the next generation.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Amina is saying we close. The problem is that if you give me office, I open and close it when I want, right? Yeah, that's the problem. I know Amina is worried about the rent and etc. But we are in Africa, right? We can just go to the bush. I just wanted to say something about all this conversation, all from there, that there's something that Yvonne Adhiambo said 3 days ago. And she said she writes intentionally. She writes with an intention. And if you disagree with it, you can have a conversation again. I've always thought that Ngugi actually writes very intentionally. And it's interesting that I had just given a paper before, and somebody stood up and said, "Are you sure you are not essentializing women?" And I said, "I'm studying these women very intentionally." So if I essentialize them, it's very intentional. I think we got to do some things intentionally. And I'll give you the last anecdote that scientists, right? When Thomas Piketty, who is the star economist today, writes about inequality in the world and capitalism, on the Kenyan scene, he does not read a single document from the central bank or the departments of economics. He reads Major Mwangi. Yeah, he reads Major Mwangi. Go and check. He reads Major Mwangi. So literature has economics in it, has politics in it, has sociology in it, and it is very intentional. Actually, I've always told my colleagues who teach economics that why is it they don't teach economics 101, the African section, using things fall apart? Because Chinua Achebe intentionally goes to borrow yam seedlings and eventually becomes a rich man because he knows how to calculate, when to plant, when to harvest, etc. But I want to close this. And intentionally, this gentleman here, Dofa, we went to Arusha almost 10 years ago. We had these little intentional dreams of East African cooperation, sisi ni jumuiya moja. And this gentleman went to a library in Arusha and picked a document, the Arusha Declaration document, book actually, and came with it to Nairobi. That's how intentionally Tanzanians are. They could trust these thieving Kenyans to borrow a book, but somehow the spirits realized this man is not a thief. So he came with the book to Kenya, read it. I asked him, "Can I photocopy it?" He said, "Yeah, photocopy it and read it because I need to return it to Arusha." And he did return it. And I can put my life in this gentleman's hands. So he's going to close this thing, Amina, with the poem. Once he says the last words of the poem, you can walk out. You can go home. If you don't have enough money in your pocket because you don't have an ID to bribe the police, you can just leave the tea for us, okay? So Dofa will close this for us today with a poem that he has done in honor of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. It began with artwork. It ends with artwork. Thank you very much, good people, for being very patient. And we invite you to the next forum, which will somehow choreograph, whether BIE or RVIE wants or not. Thank you.
Good evening. Well, I almost forgot that happened, it's good. Thank you for mentioning that. I think the one thing that keeps on coming up every time you talk about Ngugi is that his writing was useful, right? And a lot of the times when you're talking about writing,
it's only useful to scholars, right? But Ngugi's writing was, like Yusuf said, he was a people's writer, right? It was useful to actual people, like everyday people. So when you read Ngugi's work, it doesn't matter whether it's the novels, the poetry, the essays, you find it useful in your life, whether on your academic level or in your own lives and the decisions you make, right? And that's why we're talking about decolonization, in reference to his work, all right? And I think, so I wrote this poem when I learned about his passing. So this is my ode to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. For the humble son of the cold bosom of Limuru, the shining beacon of Kamirito, our bridge across the river between generations, class, and race. Your writings, the broken grain that took root in our minds to decolonize our language, emancipate our thoughts. In your prison diary, we find our freedom. Through the barrel of your pen, you've preserved our history, safeguarding our very humanity, despite your own peril. We weep not for the loss of you, but at the cognizance of the space you held for us, with grace and unmatched valor. If we can secure the base with half your grit, we shall prevail. We should. After all, we are offshoots of the same domain that forged you, and descendants of the warriors who fought off imperialism and the colonial scourge. We are Matigari, the remnants of greatness.